All right, everyone, we are going to get started. I'd like to thank you for joining us for today's lecture, Lucy Henry Harrison, The Edwardian Age at Red Hill. My name is Cody Youngblood, and I'm the curator at Patrick Henry's Red Hill, a nonprofit devoted to education and historic preservation, which maintains and interprets Red Hill, Patrick Henry's last home and burial place, as a historic site. I'm very excited to see everyone here, and I hope you'll enjoy our presentation. If you have any questions throughout the lecture, please feel free to type them in the chat box, and they'll be answered at the end. Now, Lucy Henry Harrison, The Edwardian Age at Red Hill, is one of several educational talks held throughout the year as part of our Red Hill Rediscovered lecture series. We're so grateful to our partners at Virginia Humanities for funding these programs. If you'd like to learn what programs we have coming up, please visit us online at redhill.org for a full schedule. Now, to get us started, we'll begin with the 1790s, when Patrick Henry was met with retirement age and moved to Red Hill, his 13th and last home in 1794. The property spanned over 2,900 acres and operated as a working tobacco plantation, producing about 20,000 pounds of tobacco a year. From then, the property and its 2,900 acres was inherited by Henry's two sons, John and Edward, in 1815. 17 years later, the sons split the property, with Edward building a new house and John remaining at Red Hill with about 1,000 acres. John then takes on the task of expanding his father's plantation. He does this through the purchasing of additional enslaved persons, building of additional agricultural structures, and expanding the main house. And you can see a result of those expansions here. The original circa 1772 Henry house is seen here. And according to an 1832 builder's receipt, John added the lean-to the right, the hyphen in the center, and a two-story Greek Revival style block on the left. John's wife Elvira also planted the D-shaped boxwood maze that flanks the entrance to the house on the right and the left side. Now, after its expansion, the house accommodated 8 family members. This included John, who you see here on the left, his wife Elvira on the right, and their 6 children, Margaret, Elvira, William, Thomas, Laura, and Emma. And our story continues with John and Elvira's 3rd child, William Wirt Henry, who was born at Red Hill in 1831. William Wirt Henry was named for William Wirt, a U.S. Attorney General and Patrick Henry's first biographer, who published his book in 1817 titled Sketches of the Life and Character of Patrick Henry. In November 1854, William married Lucy Gray Marshall and had 5 children. A prominent Richmond lawyer, Wirt fought in the Civil War as a Confederate soldier and returned to Red Hill as Commonwealth Attorney for Charlotte County. Both William and his wife Lucy were proud of their heritage, and in 1890, Wirt became the founding president of the Virginia Society of the Sons of the American Revolution, while his wife became the founding state regent for the Virginia Society of the Daughters of the American Revolution. And this pride for one's family history certainly passed to the couple's 2nd child, Lucy Gray Henry, who was born at Red Hill in 1857. Nicknamed Gracie, little is known of young Lucy's childhood, but we assume most of her teenage years were spent in Richmond with her parents, as Red Hill only served as their summer home following the Civil War. It was in Richmond that Lucy met her future husband, Matthew Bland Harrison, a native Virginian and lawyer who by 1886 had begun turning to the real estate business. According to family rumor, Lucy refused to marry Matthew at first because he was poor. Supposedly, she said, quote, "You make a fortune and I will marry you." Now, Matthew did indeed make a fortune, and on Thursday, October 2nd, 1886, a wedding announcement appeared in Richmond's The State newspaper, saying in part, quote, "Miss Gracie Henry and Mr. Matthew Harrison were married yesterday afternoon at 4 o'clock at the home of the bride's father, Mr. William Wirt Henry, on Franklin Street, Reverend Dr. Hodge officiating. The bride wore a traveling suit. There were no bridesmaids. The ceremony took place in the presence of quite a number of friends, but there were no cards. Mr. and Mrs. Harrison left yesterday evening for their Western home," end quote. Now, their Western home, as the article said, was in Duluth, Minnesota, and would soon be one of immense Victorian grandeur. Here is the home which Lucy and Matthew constructed in 1889. It was designed by architect Oliver G. Traphagen in the shingle style and cost $11,000, which is about $360,000 in today's money. And all this money, no doubt, came from Matthew's successful real estate ventures, where he bought up land and sold it for a profit to railroad developers and factory owners. In fact, Matthew became one of the largest land dealers in the city when he opened the Mesabi range of iron mines. While living here, Lucy gave birth to her only child, a daughter named Louise Henry, in 1888. And it's possible that young Louise is pictured here in front of the house with her governess next to her. Now, Lucy and Matthew's wealth and social standing again rose when Matthew was chosen to be the commissioner for the World's Columbian Exchange representing Minnesota. The fair would be held in Chicago in 1893 and feature 46 countries coming together to celebrate the 400th anniversary of Christopher Columbus's arrival in the New World. Unfortunately, Matthew would not live to see the exchange's opening. On March 1st, 1892, at 8 p.m., Matthew Harrison died in Duluth, and his death came as a result of Bright's disease, which is today known as acute nephritis. And nephritis is a condition in which the kidneys become inflamed and cannot filter waste from the blood. In Matthew's case, this was brought on by complications from influenza. According to local newspapers, Matthew left behind a fortune of $1 million, which equals $33 million in today's money. And here you can see an example of an infected kidney on the right. And while there's no known cure for nephritis, modern-day antibiotics can keep the condition at bay and protect the kidneys. Lucy and her daughter returned to Virginia for the burial of Matthew in the family plot at Hollywood Cemetery in Richmond. From there, the two stayed in Richmond before suffering through the death of William Wirt Henry just 8 years later in 1900. Now, in his will, William Wirt left one half of his estate to his wife and the remaining half to 3 of his children, 1/3 to each. He left out one child, however, and that child was Lucy. Interestingly, William explains his reason for leaving out his daughter in the will by writing, quote, "I have not given by this will any part of my estate to my daughter, Lucy Gray Harrison, not because I do not love her as much as my other children, but because she has already a larger estate than what I estimate my estate at." So quite an interesting turning of events. However, Lucy had other ideas. Wanting a country house of her own, Lucy purchased the land holdings of her mother and 2 siblings, and within a few years, most of Red Hill was hers. Lucy, in fact, did not buy out her sister Elizabeth, whose property spanned what is today the Quarter Place. And almost immediately, Lucy and Elizabeth set to work renovating the property. Of course, Lucy's expensive taste paired well with her husband's money. And you'll see here we've returned to Red Hill, as both John and William Wirt Henry knew it. Lucy enjoyed the home for several years, as we can see in this photograph. The image shows Lucy seated in the center, along with 2 of her siblings, her sister Elizabeth and her brother William, as well as some friends in the entrance hall of the home. Now, around 1906, Lucy enlisted the services of architect Charles Barton Keene, associate architect and builder James T. McLaughlin, and landscape architect Charles Whalen to completely transform the property. Charles Barton Keene is pictured here, looking about how Lucy would have known him. Based out of Philadelphia, Keene was one of the most prolific and popular designers of the country house in America. His practice extended from Maine to Florida, peppering the East Coast with his brand of the colonial revival style home. His work at Red Hill occurred early in his career and no doubt laid the foundation for his more notable creations in the 1920s. As a side note, and kind of a fun fact, Keene's associate architect and builder for the project, James McLaughlin, was in fact a great-grandnephew of Patrick Henry. So, beginning with the main house, Lucy and Elizabeth wanted to harken back to the 18th century by designing a new building in the colonial revival style, an architectural style which was sweeping the country. Here we can see Keene's artistic rendering of the planned expansion. In accordance with Lucy and Elizabeth's wishes, Keene planned to preserve the original Patrick Henry house, seen here on the right, and duplicate its simplistic architectural features throughout the new additions. John and Elvira, their boxwood maze was also preserved, but the formality of the gardens was to be improved through new plantings and the building of 2 pergolas attached to each end of the building. And these pergolas, however, were never built. So here we are as Red Hill is seen before the renovations. And you might be wondering, how are these renovations accomplished? Well, first, Lucy requested that the original Patrick Henry house be recorded through measured drawings. These drawings informed the foundation's reconstruction of the house in the 1950s, but unfortunately, these have since been lost. The Patrick Henry house was then disconnected from John Henry's addition and moved about 20 feet to the east. To fill that gap, a large block was added to create a central rectangular addition. Finally, an exact copy of the Patrick Henry house was recreated on the western side to complete the new mansion. The renovations more than doubled the size of John Henry's 1830 house. In total, the finished mansion contained 25 rooms, 12 fireplaces, 3 staircases, and 6 porches, totaling 6,471 square feet. The latest technologies were built into the house as well, including the introduction of gas lighting. And in keeping with the symmetrical nature of the colonial revival style, Keene ensured the front doors of the residence still aligned with the historic boxwood maze planted by Lucy's grandmother. Now, after the renovation was complete, Country Life in America published this article in their October 1912 issue. In it, they describe the new house, and I'd like to share a part of this article with you. It says, quote, "Everywhere the new corresponds in mass and detail with the old. Furthermore, the scheme has the merit of preserving the historic rooms apart from the everyday living rooms, a sort of museum, as it were. This cut in the house has now healed together, and the entire building has, after a few years, a thoroughly well-seasoned antebellum look. Inside, in spite of some inevitable touches of modernity, the charm of old architecture predominates," end quote. And speaking of the inside, here are a few images of Lucy's newly completed mansion. Here in the entrance hall, this shows the original John Henry block, which was added onto this extension through the doorway on the right. The staircase had to be rebuilt in a wider fashion, wainscoting was added, and a new colonial-style molding was added along the ceiling. And if we took a left into that doorway, we'll be in the dining room. And this is what you would be met with. Striking walls covered in wood paneling, dark mahogany furniture, and even some Patrick Henry artifacts which sat on this sideboard for the photograph. I love this little hidden doorway to the right of the fireplace, which was the entrance into the kitchen. We've now gone back into the entrance hall and taken a right into the parlor. Once again, we can see some beautifully carved molding and a Baroque-style fireplace, and even some gas lighting fixtures. The portrait above the fireplace depicts Elvira Bruce Henry, nicknamed Aunt B, who is the daughter of John Henry and Lucy's great aunt. Taking a left through the parlor, we've arrived at this bedroom. My favorite part of this room is certainly the floral and bird pattern wallpaper. And this room is also unique in that we have 2 photos taken at 2 different dates, which show the evolution of furnishings. This first image was taken in 1912, very soon after the mansion was completed. Notice the doorway which opens into the parlor, which is where we just came from. Now here's the same room again, sometime between 1913 and 1918. We have a new bed placed in front of the parlor door and a new mirror above the mantel. On the opposite side of the entrance hall sits the bedroom of Lucy Harrison. Although simple in nature, the room contains Patrick Henry's washstand next to the bed, which has luckily returned to the Red Hill collection. Another interesting item is hanging above the mantel. And this is a print of the painting called Flaming June, done by Sir Frederick Leighton in 1895. The painting is widely considered to be Leighton's best-known work. It shows a sensuous version of Night, whose figure is based on that of Michelangelo's famous statue of the same name. Interestingly, the toxic oleander branch in the top right corner, right up here, symbolizes the fragile link between sleep and death, which I think is a morbid yet appropriate symbol for a bedroom. And finally, here we are in the library. This room is dotted with family heirlooms, including Patrick Henry's mortar and pestle on the mantle, right here, and 2 matching ottomans, which once belonged to John and Elvira. Also notice the painting of Washington crossing the Delaware. As a Patrick Henry biographer said of the mansion, quote, "The woodwork inside the house is very simple. Tall mantels and brass locks show its colonial character." And speaking of heirlooms, the foundation is lucky to have a number of furnishings that were purchased by Lucy to fill her 25 rooms with. In true Victorian fashion, these ruby red glass finger bowls are part of a set of 6 and date to the mid-19th century. These candlesticks, however, belong to Lucy's sister, Elizabeth Lyons, at Red Hill, and they're silver-plated and made in the neoclassical style. So now that we've toured the house and its furnishings, let's take a look at what other parts of the property were affected by this renovation. The main house was not the only thing to change significantly. Patrick Henry's law office, once located about 225 feet north of the Henry house, survived but quite altered. Perhaps to create a more cohesive garden, Lucy ordered the law office moved about 200 feet southeast next to the Henry family cemetery. In addition, she moved her father's small square law office from the southwest corner of the Boxwood Maze to the east side of the building, connecting the two. Finally, a full second story and front portico completed the work. The building stood here until the 1950s, when the foundation removed those later additions and moved the office closer to its original location here, where it stands today. So to give you some visuals, here we can see William Wirt Henry's law office before it was moved. The Boxwood Maze is just to the left of the building, right over here. And here is Patrick Henry's law office, looking about what it would have before Lucy's alterations. These 2 buildings were then moved and morphed into this. William Wirt Henry's law office is seen here on the right, connected to the main building by a small hyphen. The main building includes Patrick Henry's original structure, with a full second story and portico added by Lucy. When completed, this newly expanded building became a caretaker's cottage for the head groundskeeper. Other outbuildings were not only renovated, but completely removed as well. The detached kitchen, for example, constructed during John Henry's time, was demolished as the new kitchen was located in the west wing of the mansion. A log cabin believed to have been constructed as a slave quarter, located where the current coachman's cabin is, was also removed by order of Mrs. Lyons to improve the undisturbed view shed from the mansion. To accommodate a larger domestic staff, a cook's cabin was built near the kitchen garden to house the mansion's cook and their family. This photograph, taken in 1918, shows who we believe to be the cook and her children. Unfortunately, the poor exposure of the camera has rendered these individuals dark and unidentifiable. Aside from the built environment, the gardens and grounds changed significantly through the help of landscape architect Charles Wayland. This map by Wayland shows just how significant these gardens were, incorporating the previously planted boxwood maze to the south of the house and other architectural features into a new formal garden. Wayland largely followed the English landscape garden, where formal boxwoods and hedgerows were used in combination with wild plantings and historic structures to create a tamed wilderness look. We discussed before the new location of the law office, which is noted on this map here. A news article noted that, quote, "An old sundial is the only pretension." And we can see that sundial on its marble base right here. The sundial has luckily made its way back into our collection, and other plantings included new trees and hedges around the house. A later addition to the boxwood maze included twin tea houses built of undressed logs to further add to the rustic feel of the garden. You can see the tea house newly built here and here around 1926, with climbing yellow jessamine plants, making it look part of the natural landscape. So if we go back to this image, you can see lots of hedges here. These tree box hedges were some of the most significant plantings made during this time, to act as both a privacy wall and to prevent farm animals from wandering into the gardens. Using green plantings like these hedges corresponds to the English-style garden as well. These hedges not only created a perimeter around the mansion, but also delineated lawns from gardens to create rooms within the landscape. In one such room was the Henry family cemetery, pictured here in 1911. The trimmed boxwoods make for a wonderful natural separation between the cemetery and the vegetable garden at the bottom right, just down here. A carpet of periwinkle covered the ground in the cemetery at this time, which I'm sure made for wonderful blooms in the spring. You can also see the stone paths laid to add a sense of formality. The path is flanked by plantings of tea, roses, calycanthus, spirea, snowballs, and other flowering shrubs. Other new plantings, which were wonderfully illustrated on this map by Charles Barton Keene, included rows of cedar and locust trees planted to the east, a cedar and pear tree planted in front of the house, rows of daffodils and varieties of flowers and shrubs. Some older plantings from Lucy's grandmother's garden were incorporated with the new, several of which were said to have come from Mount Vernon, including the Martha Washington rose seen here on the right. So everything sounds pretty great, right? Well, by 1910, cracks were already beginning to form in the financial state of Lucy Harrison. Despite her husband's $1 million fortune, it's believed so much money went into the house and gardens that it started running out before construction was even completed. So to compensate for her financial difficulties, Lucy contacted an auctioneer named Stan V. Hankels of Philadelphia to sell many of her artifacts that once belonged to Patrick Henry. The letter seen here was the first of Lucy's, written to Hankels on May 25th, 1910. In it, she says, quote, "I have had a letter from Dr. Ware Mitchell advising me to write to you about a collection of papers, books, and relics of Patrick Henry, which I wish to sell." She goes on describing the artifacts, which included 20 of Henry's law books, pieces of silver, 2 portraits, his desk, and his cane. Lucy ends her letter by requesting, quote, "I would like to get as much as $15,000 for it, and I hope very much that you will undertake to sell them for me. Of course, I want to get as much as possible for the collection, and I hope that you may be able to get more than the sum I mentioned, but I would like to get at least that much." In today's money, $15,000 is equal to almost $500,000. Now, these letters provide an interesting insight into Lucy's thought process at this time. She had no intention of donating these items to a museum. In this letter, dated June 28, 1910, Lucy apologizes for not sending the portrait of Patrick Henry to Hankels sooner. Apparently, it was on display at the Virginia State Library, and they did not want to part with it. Lucy writes, quote, "It came from the reluctance of the library officials to give it up. They spent several days in phoning and telegraphing me, begging me not to remove it." But remove it she did, going so far as to send her lawyers to the library. In another letter, Lucy inquired about selling her entire collection to J.P. Morgan, writing, quote, "I wish very much that the collection could be put into his museum. It should be kept together and at the same time be accessible to students." And on December 20th, 1910, the auction was held on Chestnut Street in Philadelphia by Samuel T. Freeman and Company. 699 objects were auctioned off, ranging from paintings and papers from many historical figures and founding fathers. And of course, many of these pieces came from collections outside of Lucy's own collection. Now on the screen here is an original copy of the auction catalog in which Lucy's collection appears. And this is one of my favorite photos from that catalog, one of many. It shows Henry's desk, which is now in the collection at Patrick Henry's Scotchtown, the chair in which Henry died, now at Colonial Williamsburg, and a silver castor set purchased by Henry while governor, now at Red Hill. When the smoke had cleared and the auction was over, Lucy received $8,488.43 for the purchase of her items. As she wrote to Hankels on December 30th, 1910, quote, "After deducting from this your commission of 10%, the expenses of insurance, express, and freight amounting to $88.10, and the expenses of the catalog, which you said would not be over $100, I will have left something upward of $7,400. This is just about half of what I wanted and expected. I'm sure you did your best, but it is a great disappointment. Back at Red Hill, after 5 years of construction, Lucy's mansion and gardens were completed in 1911. According to a local who knew Lucy, she was described as, quote, straight as an arrow, an aristocrat, and a snob. She refused to let any Henry descendant into Red Hill until he could prove his lineage. 8 years passed where Lucy and her assistant, Elizabeth Kerper, lived in the mansion, carrying out daily social calls and hosting guests and family members. Black sharecroppers, some of whom descended from those enslaved by Patrick Henry, worked the farmland at Red Hill throughout this time. One sharecropper called Lucy, quote, stern but kind. February 13th in the year 1919 proved a pivotal day in the history of Red Hill. The day started like any other. Servants awoke early, prepared the house for the day, and lit each fireplace to warm the house. One fireplace, likely on the second floor, roared to life, sending sparks up the chimney flue and landing on the cold, dry, wood-shingled roof, igniting it. As the fire spread across the roof, George Ed Britton, a teenage sharecropper driving cows along the low grounds, spotted the fire at 8 o'clock and sounded the alarm. And you can see an image of Britton here in 1975. Neighbors and tenant farmers and nearby railroad workmen all joined in to extinguish the flames and save as many furnishings as possible. Of the items saved were Patrick Henry's silver salt cellars, commissioned in 1777 to celebrate the marriage of Henry to his second wife, Dorothea, and these are now in the Red Hill collection. In the end, according to newspaper articles of the day, only furniture on the first floor and clothing from the second floor were saved. The building was a total loss. The age of Edwardian elegance at Red Hill had finally come to an end. The home had supposedly been fully insured, but we have yet to confirm this, and much of Lucy's financial situation remains a mystery to this day. What we do know is that the house was never rebuilt. Here you can see the foundation ruins as they stood until the restoration by the foundation began in the 1950s. Lucy, instead of rebuilding the house, moved into what was the caretaker's cottage, which is that little building in the center. Unfortunately for Lucy, heartbreak would strike again. For just 1 year after flames engulfed her home, Lucy's daughter Louise died, only age 31. You may remember that I said only Lucy and her assistant were living in the mansion at Red Hill. This is because Louise, in fact, lived in Baltimore. Details surrounding Louise are limited, but what we do know is that she was admitted to a psychiatric hospital known as Mount Hope Retreat for the Insane on November 7, 1907. Mount Hope Retreat opened in 1840 as a mental institution run by the Catholic Sisters of Charity, and the building you see here was built about 20 years later and opened in 1860. Now, they care for patients suffering from a variety of mental illnesses. In a list of cases they treated for the year 1917, they show, quote, moron, feeble-minded, manic, melancholic, paranoid, alcohol addiction, and more. Now, understanding mental illness in a scientific form was still in its infancy at this time, and many people, particularly women, were committed to institutions like this against their consent. They were often subjected to terrible treatments which were administered with no medical evidence for their success. Living conditions in these institutions were also quite terrible. We do not know what Louise suffered during her 13 years at Mount Hope Retreat, but we do know she suffered from dementia praecox since the age of about 15 or 16. Latin for premature dementia or precocious madness. Dementia praecox is a disused diagnosis for a chronic deteriorating psychotic disorder characterized by rapid cognitive disintegration, usually beginning in the late teens or early adulthood. Today, it's known as schizophrenia. Louise died at Mount Hope Retreat in the 28th Ward on January 3rd, 1920. Her cause of death was listed as consumption, also known as tuberculosis. Lucy had her daughter interred next to her father in the family plot at Hollywood Cemetery. Now, despite continued heartache through her life, Lucy continued living at Red Hill, welcoming visitors to her great-grandfather's grave as a pilgrimage site. One such visit by the National Society of the Colonial Dames of America is pictured here around 1926. After a visit to Henry's burial place, the dames ate lunch under the Osage orange tree, which you can see on the right. And it's obviously looking a little smaller by today's standards. In her later years, Lucy won a battle against breast cancer, but soon old age took its toll. Lucy Gray Henry Harrison finally died at age 86 at Lynchburg Memorial Hospital on April 13, 1944. Her cause of death was listed as senility, or simply old age. Family members carried her remains back to Red Hill despite bad weather and held an Episcopal service in the Henry Cemetery. Lucy's doctors said of her, quote, "She was a beautiful specimen of a lady." Lucy was buried next to her parents, sister, daughter, and husband in Hollywood Cemetery. Lucy is remembered today for her efforts to preserve Patrick Henry's home and as the last Henry descendant to own Red Hill before its purchase by the Patrick Henry Memorial Foundation, which continues to preserve it in perpetuity. And with that, I thank you for joining me for another edition of Red Hill Rediscovered. And please keep in touch with us and learn about more upcoming lectures by visiting our website and following us on social media. And now, are there any questions? If so, feel free to add them to the chat box and I'd be happy to answer any. All right. Well, I will say as a final parting word while we're thinking of questions, if anyone's got any, we are currently exhibiting several of Lucy Harrison's furnishings at Red Hill and the Henry House in an exhibition titled Dining with the Henrys. So if you'd like to see some of the nice silver pieces or pieces of china or glassware that I mentioned in the lecture, you're free to visit Red Hill and take a look at those on display. All right, I've got a question here. Could you tell us more about Lucy's sister, Elizabeth? Yes, so she has an interesting role here at Red Hill. Elizabeth, as I mentioned, lived on the Quarter Place, which is the section of Red Hill that she owned. So the Quarter Place is historically known as an area where the enslaved and later the free Black community lived, but Elizabeth actually had a house that was built on the Quarter Place. And that was there, we believe, from the early 20th century, early 1900s sometime, up until it burned, either by accident or on purpose around 1975. And Elizabeth is quite interesting because she was highly involved with the Daughters of the American Revolution and the colonial dames, serving as a state regent for a little while. And she in fact married a man named James Lyons, who was a descendant from a Lyons who was in fact Patrick Henry's you might say, opposing lawyer in the Parsons Cause case. And Lucy lived here, we believe, until her death about 1920, and she's also buried in the Hollywood Cemetery. All right. Did Lucy's husband die before she moved to Red Hill? Yes. So Lucy's husband died in the 1890s. And it's because of her husband's death that she was probably able to afford these renovations according to her personal decisions. We always call Lucy a wealthy widower because that's a widow, excuse me. That's essentially what she was. And we're currently trying to get Matthew Harrison's will to take a look at some of his finances to see if the newspapers are right, if Lucy did in fact get that $1 million fortune. So definitely stay tuned for that.